So I just finished up my whole series on shader videos, going over all the different types of basic shaders we can make. Certainly not a comprehensive and full coverage of all the different nodes on shaders, but really just covering the basics and hopefully giving you a firm foundation for making your own shaders. So now what I'm going to do is start getting into the particle system. So the combination between shaders and particles, you can get a lot of really cool special effects, and most special effects in games are using some combination, mostly actually particles for some of the really cool effects you see in games. And so what I'm going to do is go through a whole series covering all the different things you can do with the particle system. So really the particle system has a variety of different kind of core pieces that you can use to achieve certain effects. So one, you can make just a single particle used for like projectiles and things like that. You can have multiple particles. In fact, you can have up to millions of particles. I've seen some demonstrations with just large numbers of particles that can be supported. Because remember, all this particle system runs on the GPU. So it's very fast and very efficient for handling particles. You can have a continual stream of particles, so just like a fountain of particles, and do a variety of things with that. You can have just a burst of particles that just pop out and then go away right away. You can put trails on your particles, and here's where you can really use some of the shaders. You can use your own custom shader on those trails in order to get some cool effects. In fact, sometimes you may not have a particle at all. Your particle may be empty and you just want the trail for your special effect. You can actually use different sources for your particles. You can use just the default particle, or you can actually use your own mesh for a particle. And here's where using your own mesh in combination with a single particle, you can get some projectiles, which is what we're kind of going to go through on this first video. What we're going to do is make a very basic projectile using a single particle with a trail, and we'll go over some of the cool things you can do with that in order to get some pretty nice particles and projectiles pretty easily. So stay tuned and we'll dig in and create our very first projectile. So what we're going to do today is to create a projectile using the particle system. And in this case, what we want is we want just one particle that's not really going to be moving. And you'll kind of see as we go forward with some other videos why we would want to use the particle system for this. But to start with, what we're going to do is I'm going to kind of have a setup to be able to test our particles. Because as you're making it, you want to see it in action, and this is a good setup to see that. So what we have is just a kind of a default item that's going to fire the particle, and you can see it's this sphere. It's just got a cube for kind of something to stick out in front that's going to shoot out of, and then a fire point. So this fire point is what is going to actually eject the particle for us. And then I have a wall here that it's going to strike, and then just a background scene. I am going to be using some bloom, some glowing, and so I have a global volume here. If you don't know how to set that up, I do have a video, Why Doesn't My Stuff Glow? That kind of goes over all the details of how to set up a scene in order to make that work. The other thing we have to do is make sure your camera has post-processing on, this little checkbox, because by default that's not on. And post-processing is required to make the glow happen. I only mention this because I watched a lot of videos for many months and could not figure out why theirs looked cool and mine looked crappy. And that was the main reason. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to create an empty object, because we have to have a game object to connect our particle system to, and I will call this laser projectile. And I'm calling it that because what I want is a, a projectile that looks kind of like a laser bolt that would fire from like those blaster pistols, say in a Star Wars movie. I'm thinking of looking for that kind of effect. So I want kind of a glowing particle that comes out that mimics that. So I'm going to do next is I'm going to add a particle system effect to that. You can see it's below the surface there. There we go. So we see all kinds of settings on our particle system here. And there's a lot of things here, and I'm going to be going through a lot of these during my videos on particle systems. But for now, we're going to do almost one of the simplest things we can do, which is you'll notice that it's spewing out default particles at a rate. And I really only want one particle. Let's zoom in on this so we can see it closer. So what I'm going to do is this max particles, I'm going to change it from 1,000 to 1. So now we just got one particle coming out every once in a while. And I also don't want the particle to move. I don't want it spewing out and moving. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the start speed to 0 because I don't want it to move. The speed is going to be 0. So you'll notice that the particle is still being emitted kind of in some random space. And the reason is that it's this shape. So the shape says, where do I want the particles to emit from? How wide of an area? And for various effects, you might want to change that. In our case, I don't want it to spew out in any shape at all. So I'm just going to uncheck that. So now you notice my particles right in the center of the position of the particle system, which is what I want. All right, so we have our little particle there. Now, the issue is that I don't want just this default particle. I want something that looks like a projectile. So the next thing I can do is come down to our render. So the render right now, see this render mode. The render mode is billboard, and I'm going to change that to mesh. And what I can do by changing to mesh is that I can actually add my own object, right? A mesh is just an object, just like if a cube has a mesh and a cylinder has a mesh and all the imports that we import from Blender have meshes. So I can actually use one of those objects as the particle. So what I need to do is I need to have a mesh that I import from Blender. And what I've done is I've drawn just a simple drawn in Blender, obviously nothing fancy, just an elongated object that's kind of pointed at both ends, and I've exported that into my project. And so if we come over here, we can look that I've actually exported it as this laser. And we don't want the material. What we want is this cube is the mesh. You can see here's our item that we exported. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to our particle system, grab the mesh. I got to come down here, and I'm going to drag it into the mesh here. It's called cube because I didn't name it. This is just the default name of the mesh. When I made it in Blender. You might want to name it in Blender so it makes more sense, but it doesn't really matter because there's only one mesh in this object anyway. Now you notice that we're not seeing, it's kind of pointing right at us, and I don't want that. And the reason it's pointing at us is this render alignment. So when we're using a default particle or we're using an image for a particle, the image only has 2 dimensions, and the default is view because it's going to align that with the view, meaning no matter what my view is, it's always going to show me the actual image full on, not like on the edge. In our case, we have a 3D object, so I don't want that to be view. What I want it to be is local. So that's going to actually use the local coordinate system for aligning our object. And you notice that I can't see much of it. a lot of it is transparent because I'm still using this particle unlit material. And remember, we can assign a material, meaning we could use our own shaders. We can use a built-in shader and a built-in material for this. And in order to work with it, I'm just going to grab one of our other materials just for now, just so we can kind of see the object. So I'll grab this green material. I'm going to drag that instead. And now what we see is just our solid object. And it's kind of scaled it to be more square. And we can change that because we want it, we want it smaller. You notice it's way too big to be ejected out of our test here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll up to the top and we see this transform. So what I can do is I can transform and scale my object. So I want it to be like 0.1. I'm going to scale 0.1, 0.1, and then maybe make this like 0.3, maybe a little longer, 0.4. That looks like it might be the right size. We'll have to adjust it again once you kind of try it out and get everything working. You can see what makes sense. The other thing we want is you'll notice that this is not aligned with the actual position of our laser projectile because these are not 0. So we change that 0, 0. Now you'll see that it is right in the same position as our laser projectile. Not sure exactly. Those numbers are never 0. Not sure what they come in as default, but we can change those easy enough. So now this is aligned, but we really don't want, when it gets ejected, we want our position of our particle to either be at the front or the back. And I'm going to make it at the front because when it strikes something, right, I want it kind of from the front of our particle. So what I'm going to do is offset the Z a little bit. I'm going to select the Z and I'm just going to, grab this. Right now it's right there. So I'm going to grab this and move it up a little bit. A little bit more. All right. So now when we position our laser projectile, when it's ejected, it will be ejected. It will kind of appear right in front of wherever it's being blasted from. All right. So now what we got to do is we got to add some components to this because in order to move, it has to have a velocity and it has to interact with things. It has to strike the wall. So what we need to do is we need to attach some components here. Of course, we need our physics components. First of all, we need a rigid body in order to have a velocity. And we don't want to use gravity because laser bolts don't drop with gravity. They just keep going straight. We also want to add a box collider. And so, of course, our box collider is centered right by default around our empty object, but we want it to, the box to actually enclose our visible projectile. So we can click that guy, we can drag him up there, drag him back there. It doesn't have to be super precise, it's just kind of test everything out. Oops. It's always annoying. Those little squares are very small. All right, that's pretty good. So our collision box is right around our projectile. So a couple other things is that this fire point. So what I have is I have a script here. So you'll notice that the fire point, which is right there, is where the position where our projectile is going to appear. I have a script that I've written, and it is basically every time I hit the space bar, it's just going to position, it's going to create the projectile, position it here at the point, and it's going to give it a velocity. And the velocity will be based on this speed. So what I need is a default particle. So I am going to delete this guy. Going to take the laser projectile we just made. Select my fire point. First of all, I have to drag it into my projectiles. I have to give it a prefab first. Then I have to drag that into the default object like that. All right. The other thing I need to do on the prefab is I have to add a script on it too, because it has to detect when it hits the wall. And I have this projectile hit. So essentially that's just a script that's going to detect when it hits the wall, and as soon as it hits the wall, it's just gonna delete the object. It's pretty basic stuff. So let's hit play. It's moving. Can't really see it because it's you can see that little green thing shooting across. So that seems to be working. But of course we can't really see it very well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to select this. We can either modify it over here and drag it back, or we can do this open prefab. So I can go into the prefab. There's our object. Go into the particle system, and the last thing I'm going to do for now is to go into my render, and instead of this green material, I have this red glow material. Open our materials. I've used this red glow in a couple of my other videos. Just going to drag that in, and so what that does is it will, since we have our global volume and we have our bloom set, it's going to show our projectile glowing red, which is what we want for that effect. So let's try it out now. We can see we have our little laser shooting across. Let's get rid of, delete this for now. So you'll notice one thing, you'll notice that when it shoots, it's not appearing right here. And why is that? It's appearing way out here. And the reason is, let's stop this. So the last things we need to do, go into our prefab, select our particle system, is that this pre-warm needs to be checked. And what that means is it will kind of get the render all done, the rendering done before it emits it. Because if that pre-warm isn't on, it will create it before it's ready to render it. Not sure how the whole system works, but you have to have that pre-warm on in order for it to appear immediately. So now let's go back here, hit play. Now we can see it's appearing right there. It's goes pretty fast. And what we might want to do is to still, sometimes it appears early. So what we might want to do is, if you're not happy and you don't really know what it's going to look like until you try it, which is why you want this setup. You need to be able to make adjustments, try them out, see how they look, make more adjustments. It's kind of a trial and error type of thing. So what I'm going to do is, one last thing is, remember the position of our particle system, right? Versus where our object is, we kind of moved it. And so if we move this forward, or actually back, right over the top of it, it's kind of offset even a bit. So we want is we want the position of this, we want it to actually be created inside of our whatever it's being ejected from. So the front of it starts appearing first. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, see, I like that a lot better. See, now it looks like it's always kind of coming out of the chute. You really don't know what it's going to look like until you try it. So it looks okay, but we need to make some more changes, actually additions, and possibly some changes to get a better looking laser bolt. It still looks just like a glowing object coming out of there. And what we can do is we're going to add a trail to it. So I'm going to show you how to do a trail and tweak that in order to get a better looking projectile. And I'm not sure if the size is exactly, it might be a little big. We'll see what it looks like once we get a trail added to see if we're happy with the size. So let's work on the trail next. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a trail to our game object in addition to our particle. So that'll give a little nicer look, to have a little more elongated glow pattern. And so what we're going to do is first we're going to go to our projectile. We're going to open the prefab. We are going to go up to our particle, add another effect, trail. There is a trails on the particle system itself. This one gives a little more. I just found this one easier to use in order to get the effects I want. The time is trickier to do on that trail, and I haven't had good luck with it. So you can also add a trail directly this way. So the time is how long the trail is going to exist. So let's just keep it at the default for now. This is going to be the width of the trail. It's going to be the material. So first of all, the material, what we want is a glow pattern material, and I don't want it as bright as the other material. We can try that just for default. So you'll see what that looks like. The color isn't necessary if we're using our own material like this. If you use the default particle, I believe the color comes into effect. So we've added a trail, 5 seconds. Let's just see what that looks like. We'll hit play. Whoa, so that's really bright and really fat. So we have to make a few adjustments. So getting something started, it's not a big deal. Just see what it looks like so we can kind of see where we want to go from here. First of all, the time, we don't want it to extend that long. So let's maybe try 0.5. The width definitely has to change. Let's make it pretty narrow. And then we're going to bring it down to 0 at the end because we want it to fade off into nothing. So let's try that. Some things you have to stop playing, otherwise it won't take effect once you stop, but a lot of these will. All right, so it's better. It's still a little long. That 0.5 is probably still a little long. So let's go back. Let's change that with the time. Let's change it to like maybe 0.1. Still a little fat. Let's go back down to 0.27, and it's just too bright. We don't want it as bright as our projectile. It's supposed to be just kind of the trail. So I have this red glow darker that I'm going to use, and I'll kind of show you what I did for that and how it's different. So let's go back here. If we could look at this red glow darker 1, I'm using this particle lit. So if we go in here, particles. First of all, it takes transparency into account a little better. So I have it set to transparent. So we can actually add a pattern to it, and I've done that before. There's lots of options you can do on some of these. In this case, I've just done transparent alpha front. So we try that out. It's a little dark. You can see it, but it's not very bright. So let's go to our kind of set up more on the orangey. Let's change it more to that red. Can increase this intensity a little bit. Make it a little brighter. It takes a lot of tweaking around, and I played around with these for quite some time. It looks better. So really it's a matter of personal preference, and it takes quite a bit of trial and error in order to really see it. Let's just make it big. I'm going to drag it to my other screen here. So you can see it kind of blowing up full screen. That's not bad. It's still a little bright here. There's some other things we can do with masking, and there's lots of other options that I'll be going over with my next video on some of our options. Like I said, you set up a situation like this, you can play around. You know, not bad. It's a little bright. What would be nicer is if it was brighter at the front and kind of darkened as it went back. But I think this is good for now. Again, it's a good start to our videos here and on the basics of the particle system. Again, it's pretty complicated, and I just can't stress enough that it just takes a lot of trial and error to get these things exactly right. You can play around with materials, you can play around with masking and make your own shaders and create your own materials from those shaders in order to get lots of different options. So again, this is just an intro, good start. Keep tuned for more on the particle system, and dig into some of those other options to get a lot more cool effects. And we're going to be working on another different projectile next, and maybe I'll tweak those trails and make it look a little better for my next video. So again, thanks for watching. If you find these useful, again, I try to focus on really explaining the details of each of the pieces versus just going through quick and showing you how to put together some cool looking effect. Because if you don't understand it, you can't make your own, you can't make use of it, you can't tweak it, because you really don't know what these pieces are doing. So hope this helped you get an intro to particle system and making some projectiles, and stay tuned for my next video.